By December of 1944, the German High Command was desperate. The Allied armies were pressing hard against the borders of the German homeland, and the Third Reich was running out of time. In absolute secrecy, Adolf Hitler assembled a massive force of 250,000 soldiers and hundreds of advanced panzer tanks for a colossal surprise attack through the heavily forested Ardennes region. The German operational plan relied entirely on speed, surprise, and a total collapse of American morale. German generals, operating under strict Prussian military doctrines, believed that American soldiers were soft, overly reliant on material superiority, and prone to panic when their communication lines were cut. On paper, the plan was flawless. The German armored columns would punch through the weak American lines, create absolute chaos, and race toward the sea before the Allies could coordinate a response. Initially, the gamble worked perfectly. The front line fractured, and thousands of American troops were sent retreating in confusion. But as the German panzers sped westward, they realized that every major road in the region converged at a single, vital geography point, a small Belgian crossroads town named Bastogne. To secure the entire offensive, the German army had to take Bastogne immediately. What they did not expect was that the Supreme Allied Command had rushed a single, lightly armed division into the town to hold it, at all costs the 101st Airborne Division. By the 20th of December, the German forces had completely surrounded Bastogne. The 101st Airborne, along with elements of the 10th Armored Division, was entirely cut off from the rest of the Allied army. They were outnumbered by a ratio of nearly 5-to-1, completely enveloped, and running catastrophically low on ammunition, medical supplies, and winter clothing. According to traditional German military textbooks, an encircled force with no hope of immediate rescue had only two logical options: retreat immediately or surrender to avoid total annihilation. German generals confidently expected the American paratroopers to follow this textbook logic, but the Screaming Eagles did not look at encirclement the way regular infantry did. As paratroopers, their entire training was based on dropping behind enemy lines. Being surrounded was not a tactical disaster for them. It was exactly how they were trained to operate. Instead of collapsing inward or attempting a desperate, disorganized breakout, the 101st Airborne established a dynamic, elastic perimeter around the town. They dug deep into the frozen earth, using the sub-zero temperatures and the thick pine forests as natural defensive shields. When the German infantry launched their first coordinated attacks, expecting to clean up a panicked and defeated enemy, they were met with organized, overlapping fields of heavy machine gun fire. The Americans were not acting like a surrounded army, they were acting like the ones holding the high ground. On the 22nd of December, the German military commanders grew frustrated by the lack of progress. The German General Heinrich von Leutwitz sent a formal delegation under a white flag to the American lines, carrying a written demand for the honorable surrender of the Bastogne garrison. The letter explicitly detailed that the town was completely surrounded by heavy German armored units and that total annihilation was the only alternative to surrender. When the letter was delivered to the acting commander of the 101st Airborne, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, his initial reaction was not fear or contemplation. It was pure, unfiltered disbelief. He looked at the document and simply muttered a single word: nuts. When it came time to send an official written response to the waiting German officers, McAuliffe was unsure of what to write. His staff officers convinced him that his first reaction was completely perfect. The final, official reply delivered to the German High Command read exactly as follows to the German commander: nuts. Signed, the American commander. The German generals were completely baffled by the response. They literally had to ask their translators what the word meant. When they finally understood that it was an absolute, mocking refusal to surrender, the German commanders realized they were dealing with an entirely different breed of soldier. The psychological shock value of their massive encirclement had completely failed to register. Infuriated by the insulting rejection, the German army unleashed a hellish artillery bombardment on the town, followed by massive armored thrusts using elite panzer grenadier divisions. The German generals expected that even if the American officers were stubborn, the ordinary soldiers in the frozen foxholes would break under the sheer weight of heavy armor. Once again, the German tactical expectations were completely subverted. The German panzers managed to breach the thin outer perimeter in several locations, driving deep into the fields surrounding Bastogne. In standard European warfare, a tank breakthrough meant the defensive line was broken and a retreat must follow. But the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne did something the German tank crews found terrifying. As the massive German tanks breached the lines, the American infantry did not flee. They stayed flat in their frozen foxholes, letting the heavy armor roll completely past them. The moment the tanks were through, the paratroopers rose up and fiercely engaged the following German infantry with rifles and machine guns, completely cutting off the armor from its foot support. Meanwhile, small, mobile American teams armed with bazookas and anti-tank guns hunted the isolated German tanks through the foggy streets and snow-covered woods, destroying them one by one. The German generals realized too late that the 101st Airborne did not rely on a rigid line of defense. They practiced fluid aggression, treating every single square inch of the Bastogne perimeter as a localized combat zone where they could outmaneuver and destroy superior forces. By the 26th of December, the elements of General George Patton's Third Army finally broke through the German encirclement from the south. Relieving the siege of Bastogne, the German generals had wasted critical days, massive amounts of fuel, and thousands of elite troops trying to crush a single, unyielding pocket of resistance. Because the 101st Airborne refused to yield the vital crossroads of Bastogne, the entire timeline of Hitler's Great Ardennes offensive was completely ruined. The German panzer divisions ran out of fuel in the freezing snow, their supply lines choked by the stubborn American hold on the town. The German army had entered the Ardennes, expecting a swift victory over a shattered enemy. Instead, they ran directly into a force that transformed a desperate survival situation into a masterclass of defensive warfare. The Battle of Bastogne permanently altered how the German military viewed the American fighting spirit. German generals who survived the war wrote extensively in their journals about the shock of encountering the airborne divisions. They admitted that they had drastically underestimated the tactical independence and the psychological resilience of the American paratrooper. The 101st Airborne Division proved that elite status is not defined by having the heaviest tanks or the most pristine supplies. It is defined by a culture of absolute self-reliance and a refusal to acknowledge defeat even when completely surrounded in the freezing dark. The Screaming Eagles walked into the snows of Bastogne as a lightly armed infantry division. They emerged as a legendary force that had single-handedly broken the momentum of Germany's final offensive, leaving the German High Command to forever regret the day they expected the airborne to break.